Hello, and welcome to this edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm New York State Senator Robert Jackson, representing the 31st Senatorial District that stretches from Marble Hill all the way down to 26th Street and 9th Avenue, 13 miles. Today, we're not talking about me, we're talking about a big victory for education that was won by all of us as a team coming together in order to continuously fight for the type of resources, in essence, money, that our children rightfully deserve. And so we have two fantastic guests that were involved for many, many years. Michael Rebell, the Executive Director for the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College, and Jasmine Gripper, the Executive Director of AQE. Now you say, what is AQE? The Alliance for Quality Education, a statewide advocacy group that has organized people all over the state to make sure our children get the money to have the opportunity for a sound basic education. So these are the two advocates that we have today. And so first, I would like to introduce Michael Rebell and let him say hello to you, tell him who you are, what you do, Michael, and then we'll turn to Jasmine Gripper. So Michael Rebell.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Robert. And I think my strongest claim to fame is that many, many years ago, more than I like to count sometimes, I met a guy named Robert Jackson, who was a real proponent for educational equity and educational fairness. And he and I teamed up and formed something called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. We fought a very big litigation that many of you may be aware of. And that resulted in an increase in funding for kids in New York City and actually throughout the state of billions of dollars. But as we'll talk about in this broadcast, it's taken the state a while to pay out the full bill of what they promised after we won this big court case. But in any event, I'm still fighting through the courts for educational equity for kids in New York and nationally. I'm also a professor at Teachers College and Columbia University. The other thing I've been doing lately is pushing a federal case to establish a right under the US Constitution for all kids to get the kind of education they need to be capable citizens who can do better than our adult generation is doing now with preserving our democracy.
Well, thank you, Michael, and I appreciate your advocacy and you're continuously working on behalf of the people of our great state and our country. Jasmine Gripper, you are a shining star in the advocacy community. You've been at this for a while on behalf of AQE and the people of our great state, especially our children. Tell us who you are and what is AQE and how long have you been doing this on behalf of the people of the state of New York?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Jackson, and really happy to be on this platform with you who have been a leader in this fight for so many years to get these resources to our children. The Alliance for Quality Education was literally created to complement the lawsuit that Mike Rebell was just talking about, to make sure parents were aware that New York City parents were suing the state and that these resources were going to help students everywhere. And so the outcome of the original CFE court case, New York State committed to increasing funding to schools statewide by $5.5 billion over 4 years. We saw 2 consecutive years of that funding, and then the financial recession happened. And New York State literally reneged on its promise and took all of that money from our kids. And we've been fighting back since. We've been organizing parents, building parent power and parent leadership. We would talk to parents, what do you want to see in your schools? And what we always would hear is we want smaller class sizes. We want more support staff, guidance counselors. We want literacy coaches. We want restorative justice counselors. Everything that they wanted took money and resources. And the schools did not have the money to do what they needed to do to provide our children with a sound basic education. And so we would come back to Albany year after year and demand the funding for our kids. And this year we finally won a significant victory that on top of all the federal dollars coming to New York schools, New York State finally recommitted itself to state dollars to increase funding by $4 billion over the next 2 years. And that is a significant investment in education. And that's going to transform educational opportunities for children across the state.
Well, thank you on behalf of the people of the state of New York. Now, Michael, you talk about 30 years. Tell us how this case started and walk us through the steps as far as why did we have to go to the Supreme Court, the Appellate Division, the Court of the highest court in the state of New York, the Court of Appeals, and then not only that once, but twice and three different times.
Well, the short answer, Robert, is the wheels of justice clank slowly. But at least in this case, I think they've moved very much in the right direction, and a total victory is in sight. But yes, the rule of law requires painstaking efforts at every stage. And what we were faced with when we began this case is that there was an earlier case where a group on Long Island back in the 1980s had tried to bring to the court's attention the great inequities in funding throughout the state, and they lost the case. So the picture was not rosy. It was really a difficult case to bring. I got involved in this case because, as I mentioned, a man named Robert Jackson came into my office one day, and he was then the president of Community School Board 6 in Manhattan. And he said, and I was their attorney, and he said, Michael, you got to do something about this state education funding formula. This was back in the 90s, and there was a big cut in funding that year, mid-year cut. And Robert was very concerned about what it was doing to class sizes, to all kinds of services in District 6. And I said to him, Robert, I know the formula is unfair and something should be done about it, but court's not the route. They've already ruled against us. They said the Constitution doesn't require this, and you ought to go to the legislature. And Robert said to me, we've been to the legislature. They're not going to do anything. This is very political. So Robert pushed me. He wouldn't take no for an answer. And that led me to do some research and to come up with a theory. And I remember telling Robert and the board of directors of this new organization we formed, mainly to bring this lawsuit that was called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. I said, look, we'll fight this thing hard, but I would say we have maybe a 10% chance of sticking with it. But we did stick with it. And Robert was the main back of all of us. He had everybody's back. And we tried our new theory. The lower court judge didn't buy it, but we went up to the highest court and they bought it. So they said, okay, you've got a different theory. We'll be interested to see if you can prove it. You got to prove that kids in New York City are not getting a sound basic education. And first of all, you got to define what a sound basic education is. Then when we know what it is, are they getting it? And if they're not getting it, you have to prove that the cause of it is a lack of state funding. So that was a tall order, and it took us years to gather all the information. We had to get all these details about the state education funding system, about every aspect of education in New York City. So that's why it took so long. And after we won the first time, it went up to the Court of Appeals again, and that takes months and years. And when they upheld our victory, then we had the remedy. What are we going to do about it? How do we get more money? So that was the third round. So it is complicated, but although the wheels of justice move slowly, I'm very pleased that in this case, it looks like they ultimately brought what they needed to bring. And we're very happy with what the outcome of the case is. And now it looks like the legislature is going to finally, in an honorable way, do what they were committed to doing.
We hope so. So Michael, let me thank you for, obviously from a legal point of view, but part of the strategy was to make some noise out there, to organize people around the state of New York. And I remember when I said that when the appellate division said that our kids were only entitled to, I think, a 6th grade in reading and 8th grade in math. And I said, no way would the highest court in the state of New York agree with that. And so I said to you, I remember when we go to the highest court, I'm going to walk all the way to Albany. And I remember Assembly member from Brooklyn kept hounding me. So when are we walking to Albany? When are we walking to Albany? I said, oh my gosh, And bottom line is, when we walked to Albany, and we coined it, walk a mile for a child. And so that was very, very important. Obviously, it was very symbolic, the walk to Albany. And I remember on the 7th day of the walk, and Samira Ahmed, our deputy director for the campaign for fiscal equity, said, Robert, we're going to be in court tomorrow. Please make sure you put on a suit. And I turned to her and I said, Samira, I didn't bring a suit. I want to go in there smelling as funky as I can be. Oh my gosh, after walking for 8 days, that they be able to smell me in the back of the room. So we walked in with our t-shirts and walk a mile for a child with AQE and other stickers on our t-shirts. And we were very successful from an organizing point of view. But that goes to Jasmine. So Jasmine, tell me, how could you sustain an organizing campaign for years without losing the energy of the people involved?
Yeah, that was hard work to make this issue stay front and center for people for so long. One, I will say we had small victories along the way, right? We would win increases in school funding. We saw an increase in state aid that led to the expansion of pre-K in New York City. And so we were winning victories. We saw money being invested in community schools. New York State invests more in community schools than any other state. So we were winning small things along the way that would keep us energized. But we still kept our eyes on the prize, which was the big win. The millions of dollars here and there were important, but we wanted the billions that our kids were owed, and we would never back away from that. And so we would just keep talking to parents on the streets, at the schools, and then we kept coming back to Albany. I remember, Robert, you're talking about the first walk to Albany. We walked to Albany on the 10-year anniversary of that day.
I walked with you too.
Yes. 150 miles from New York City to Albany. And we had the nerve to walk from downtown City Hall all the way up. But in addition to that, I remember putting pink invoices all over the governor's office and said, this money is due to our kids. And we constantly would build up the drumbeat that we were not going to settle on good. We wanted our kids to have everything that they needed, and it wasn't enough. And the other thing that kept driving us is that you could go into the schools and see the need. You went into the schools. Robert, you went on our tour, our statewide tour of education. We saw kids doing lessons in closets, in locker rooms, because there wasn't enough space in the school building. We saw kids, I saw a kid, what is that, 2 or 3 years ago, using Windows 95 in their classroom. We're like, this is not up-to-date technology. We saw schools that said they had to share a librarian. From 3 schools had to share 1 librarian. So that means those kids didn't have access to research skills. And literally, parents knew their kids weren't getting a quality education. And so we were like, what we're experiencing now is not good enough. And we need to make sure our kids have the resources and the tools they need to succeed. And so every year we would keep the drumbeat alive. Every year we would demand from Albany that they fully fund our schools, and really proud of the leadership we now have in Albany with Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Carl Hasty, who have always remained committed to education. And I want to especially shout out the Senate Majority Leader, because not only is she a former educator, she was a part of that original CFE statewide tour. So she knew what we were fighting for in our classrooms. And so the power dynamics in Albany mattered, and the power of the parents demanding this is what mattered and helped us to bring this victory home for our children.
I remember, Michael, that in their decision, the highest court defined what a sound basic education was. And they basically, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, they said that students should graduate from high school knowing how to read, knowing how to write, knowing how to serve on a jury, and being able to hold competitive employment. That is the minimum standard that education we should give our children. So I understood in 2007, when the economy collapsed from a financial point of view, and the state of New York did not continue the funding that we were entitled to under the lawsuit. Then again, you as an attorney, you went back in court again and filed a lawsuit for the $4 billion going back about 5 years ago. Can you tell us about that lawsuit and where it is right now?
Okay, before I get to that, Robert, I just do want to clear something up, because there is some ambiguous language in those CFE decisions, but I don't think it's a minimal definition that they gave. And there's a part of it that we haven't emphasized as much in the past, but we need to emphasize going forward in the future. And that is they use the word meaningful. So they said a sound basic education requires a meaningful opportunity for all students to develop the skills they need to function productively as civic participants capable of voting and serving on a jury. Now, I've been doing a lot of research recently on what skills kids need to be good voters, to be good jurors, to be civically engaged. And I tell you, those are high-level skills. And there have been some of the legal developments recently that lead me to say, in the future, and I want to talk to Jasmine about this too for future advocacy, we've got to emphasize that word meaningful. And for many of our kids who come from poverty backgrounds, meaningful means they have to get the services they need, especially post-pandemic. They're going to need a lot of these academic intervention services. A lot of kids are going to need mental health services. They're going to need a lot of tutoring to catch up. So I think that's all encompassed by this concept of meaningful opportunity. But anyway, yes, let me talk a little about the NYSER case. We did have to bring a new.
What's a NYSER? Can you give, what is that acronym? Can you?
Okay, the acronym is New Yorkers for Students' Education Rights, NYSER. And we picked that acronym, quite frankly, because when we had to do this in 2014, because the state was holding back from paying out what they had promised, we wanted to emphasize that we were going to be nicer to kids than Governor Cuomo had been. So that was part of the reason we loved that acronym. But anyway, this was a major statewide effort. This time around, we have a lot of the New York City advocacy groups. We have the about half of the community education councils are members of NYSER, but we also have the state school boards, the state superintendents, the statewide PTA. So it was an effort to unite the whole state. And you know, you and I had done that in CFE, even though the CFE case was brought on behalf of kids in New York City. We had for 5 years that massive statewide public engagement process. We built allies around the state. But this time we said, we're looking to get these reforms for everybody. So it was really, in this day and age where everybody's so polarized, the fact that we brought everybody together in this coalition we called NYSER, we thought was a great achievement. Anyway, we've been fighting again, and as you pointed out in the beginning, this takes time. We filed the case in 2014. We had this motion to dismiss. They wanted to throw it out again, and we had to go back to the Court of Appeals through all these levels of appeals. We won in the Court of Appeals in 2017. They sent the case back for a trial again. So all over again, we have to prove that kids in New York City and in other districts that we picked today in 2021 are not getting the opportunity for the various services, that class sizes are too small, too big, that kids are not getting the AIS services, they're not getting the bilingual services. So we've had to start from scratch. You know, after all these years that passed, we have to get more information, what's happening now, not what was happening back in the 1990s. And it's been a huge job. It's taken us years to assemble all of this information, to get all the witnesses lined up, to have the pretrial depositions, but we're close to being ready. And we were planning for a trial next year and to fight this thing all over again. But now that the legislature's acted and we're getting most of the money that we've been looking for, probably it's not going to be necessary to go forward with that trial.
Where's the guarantee, Michael? Where's the guarantee that the
Yes.
funding for the second year and the third year and continuous funding thereafter?
Right. So that's what I was going to say, Robert. You're quite right there. We're not gonna withdraw this case. What we're probably going to do is keep it in abeyance, keep it ready to go if necessary, and it's continuing pressure on the governor and the legislature to say, all right, if you give us all the money you promised, in 3 years, we'll withdraw the case. Everybody will be happy. But if they don't carry out the commitment this time, we have all this information packed up. We'll have to update it, of course, if it's a year from now or 2 years from now, but pretty quickly, a lot faster than it took us in CFE. we would be able to pull the case together and bring it to the court. But I hope we don't have to do that.
Thank you. So, Jasmine, knowing the fact that what happened in 2007 when they said they would phase in the money over 4 years and then the financial crisis hit, do you anticipate that we will get the money the second year and the third year? What if, for example, something happens and the governor does not come through with that? I'm sure that the state legislature would allocate the money, but what are we going to do about that to be prepared, Jasmine, please?
Yeah, the fight's not over till it's over. We need to make sure we get every.
It's not over.
Until we get every dollar consistently for our kids. So this time is different. I will say that. One, New York State is actually already in the midst of a financial crisis due to COVID. And we were really worried that in the midst of this crisis, New York State will repeat the mistakes of the past and cut dramatically. But instead, thanks to the strength of the legislature, having champions like you, Senator Jackson, in Albany, New York took a different approach. What we did to get through the financial crisis, instead of cutting from schools, is we taxed the ultra rich. And that is the game changer we have here, is that the legislature said, instead of taking money from our children, the most vulnerable New Yorkers, we're going to ask those who have way more than enough to give a little bit more. And so what New York State did this year is where they raised income taxes on the ultra wealthy, and that's going to generate more revenue for the state. And that's really going to guarantee we have a source of income to fulfill the promise of the CFE commitment. And so we do think this time is different, because not only did we win the commitment, but we also won the increase in revenue for the state to pay for this commitment. But nonetheless, we're going to keep our eyes on Albany. We're going to still be present during the state budget fight in January to make sure that the state fulfills its promise. But we're really confident that this time is different and that the money will flow to our districts, and we don't have to worry about the state cutting it in the near future.
Well, my understanding is that besides the $4.2 billion phase in 1.4 over 3 years by New York State and the actions that we did, we all worked together on that. But also there was about $2.1 billion in December 2020 from the COVID supplemental appropriations and $4.8 billion under the American Rescue Plan. But those monies from the feds are supposedly one-shots. So do you feel that we have to be able to raise even more than the $4.2 billion in order to sustain the type of education our children are receiving? I'd like to hear a quick comment from both of you on that. Let's go to you, Jasmine, first, and then Michael Rebell.
Yeah, so one, the federal government is making this humongous investment in education. New York State has gotten about $13 billion. It's enormous. And this is really important in this moment, how we are handling our COVID response. How are we dealing with the fact that children really need to be recalibrated back into the classroom? They need to really catch up on all the learning that they missed. And they also need social and emotional supports to make sure their mental health is in the right space for learning to occur. And so the federal investments are strategic to start some new programming, to pay for the startup costs. And what we see is going to happen is that when the federal dollars run out, the state dollars are increasing. And so you're actually setting a roadmap for actually long-term success from the school districts. So we want to see from our school districts multi-year planning. The federal money does not have to be spent all at once. Districts are actually supposed to create a 3-year plan for how they plan on spending that money. And so literally when they get to that 3rd year, that's when they'll be at their full foundation aid amount, and that the state will pick up the tab from there. It's not the same level, but it's definitely enough to pay for the startup costs with the federal dollars and sustain those programs with the state dollars. And so we're really in a good position that our schools should not hit a fiscal cliff. But nonetheless, we want to make sure all of our children have the resources that they need. Is the foundation aid going to be enough? Let's fully fund the formula and to see. Is this going to be enough to make sure English language learners have what they have? Students who are new immigrants to our country, do they have the support that they need? Homeless students, when we see homelessness is skyrocketing, not only in New York City, but across the state, are those students getting adequate supports? And so data is going to be really important as we spend the money, and we need to make sure it's being targeted to our most vulnerable children so that they can have academic and life success with these new infusion of resources to our schools.
So Michael, you're the attorney now. So right now you said basically that lawsuit that we filed about 4.5 years ago is on hold. But I'd say to you that we need you to make sure that we hold the state of New York accountable from a legal point of view. So tell us now what's going to happen with respect to this particular lawsuit, as you indicated. But I want to hear from you. Are you doing this by yourself, or you have partners with you, some other people that are involved?
Yeah, we have a fantastic legal crew. We've gotten not one, but two major New York City law firms, Morgan Lewis and White and Case, that have been working on this. We've gotten about a dozen or more lawyers because it's a huge undertaking. So yes, there's been a lot of support, and our coalition now is huge statewide. But, you know, responding to your other question, Robert, what I want to emphasize, and it's picking up what Jasmine was saying, we've got to look to the future. And I think there'll be adequate funding for the next 3 years with the foundation aid money, with the federal money. But what happens thereafter? This foundation aid formula was based on an analysis done in 2006, 15 years ago. They determined how much money you needed for a sound basic education. And we thought state ed did a good job in 2006, and we agreed this was the fair amount of money that was needed back then. But nobody's done any analysis of how much is needed in 2021, let alone in 2024. So what we're calling for, and I know you're going to support this in the legislature, we've talked to other legislators, we need a new costing out study. That's a deep expert analysis with public input to closely examine how many dollars do you actually need in all these areas Jasmine mentioned, all areas of education, to provide a sound basic education for our kids in the future. And we've really got to push the legislature and the governor to agree to do this in an objective, transparent way over the next few years. So we should project on a 5-year basis how many dollars districts are going to need, how many they're going to have, and they can continue that intelligent planning into the future and not have these battles going on, whether it's in court or whether it's political. Education should be solidly funded on a stable basis going into the future.
Well, I want to say thank both of you. You're both leaders in this fight to make sure our children get a good education. And I want to thank Andrew Stewart Cousins, the Majority Leader of the New York State Senate, and Carl Heastie, the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, and our governor, for he signed it into law. I didn't want him to veto it. We don't want to override a governor's veto. So when we work together on behalf of the people of New York State, we all win. So thank you very much for coming on as our guest and understanding that this is Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Michael Rebell and Jasmine Gripper. Thank you.